I've been investigating how the mind works by observing the properties of conscious experience. And for most people, when you look at conscious experience, all you see is the world. It's hard to see what the properties are of conscious experience itself. But actually, there are a number of properties of conscious experience that actually reveal how the mind represents information. And I've been chasing down each of those little pieces of evidence and showing how they reveal how the mind works. Well, what I have learned is that the structure of the world that you see around you is actually not the world itself. It is entirely a construct in your mind based on sensory input. Now, this shouldn't be so surprising because based on the very existence of dreams and hallucinations, we know for a fact that our brain is capable of creating complete synthetic worlds that look every bit as real as the normal consensual world of reality, and therefore it shouldn't be so much of a surprise, and yet it's still controversial today, that perception is more like a guided hallucination rather than a direct viewing of the world. For example, well, the most basic example is the retinal afterimage. Whenever you look at a bright light or a camera flash and you see a spot in front of your eyes, and most people say, all right, so there's a spot, what's the big deal? A physiologist will say, well, that's just a patch on your retina that has gotten exhausted and needs to be replenished. But there's a couple of odd things about that retinal afterimage. First of all, its location. It's not back in your retina where you believe your retina to be, but out in space in front of you. And secondly, the image on your retina is inverted, but the visual afterimage is not. So how does it get from your retina out into the external world? The conclusion that I've reached is that the only way it can get out into the world is because this is not the world itself. All of this that you see is downstream of your retina and thus, in my view, inside your brain. And you can't see the world itself directly. You can only see it through its visual replica. A more positive piece of evidence is the phenomenon of perspective, or why things appear smaller when they're farther away in the distance. Now, this is something we've seen since infanthood, and nobody notices anything peculiar about it. It's just the way things are. But when you think about it, it turns out that it's very peculiar that things appear smaller if you believe that what you're seeing is the world itself. Now, we all know about perspective in photography. Even a camera suffers perspective, that farther things make a smaller image on the retina or on the film plane. But this world that we see is not the image on the retina. This world is a solid three-dimensional world, and yet it has perspective. So the world appears somewhat like a museum diorama, where you see those scenes that extend all the way to infinity, but things get smaller and smaller in the scene. What's happening is that it's a model, a three-dimensional spatial model, whose spatial scale varies as a function of distance from the viewer. In fact, it shrinks. So if you have a large-scale model in the foreground, blending continuously to a small-scale model in the background, that's a way that you can represent an infinite distance in a finite model, a finite representation. Well, it turns out that our experience has exactly that property. And that's clearly not a property of the world itself, because the world is not a model of itself. The world is the size that it is, and it doesn't change to any other size. But our experience of the world looks larger for near objects and smaller for far objects, and this itself is proof that our experience has a variable representational scale, and the fact that it has any kind of a scale at all is proof that it's a model and not the world itself. Yeah, that's right. And the way I think of it, I get very strange reactions when I propose this to people, that people will generally say, well, yeah, but everyone knew that. That's obvious. So then I explain it in a somewhat different way. I say, beyond the farthest things that you can perceive in all directions, so above and beyond the walls, floor, and ceiling of this room, beyond that is the inner surface of your true physical skull, and beyond that skull is an unimaginably immense external world, of which all this that you see here is merely a miniature internal replica. And when I explain it that way, they say, nonsense, that's impossible, that couldn't possibly be true. And yet, that's really the same thing as saying everything you perceive is inside your head. Because when you think about the alternative is even more bizarre. Because if you believe that this is the world itself, light from the world enters your eye where it's transduced to an electrical signal that goes up the optic nerve, creates some kind of pattern of energy in your brain, and as that pattern appears, the world around you suddenly comes into existence, the world of experience. There are other ways you can show, for instance, many people will say that the world and our experience of it are one and the same thing, that when we experience the world, we are experiencing it directly out where it lies in the world. But that can be disproven simply by closing your eyes and look to see what disappears. Because the real world, the objective world, does not disappear when you close your eyes, but our experience of the world vanishes when we close our eyes. And that itself shows that there are two entities, distinct entities that are not to be confounded. One is the world itself. The other is our experience of the world. They appear to be superimposed on each other, except one vanishes when you close your eyes and the other one does not. And that itself shows that the experience is causally downstream of your eyelids. When you close your eyelids, you block the flow of the causal chain, and your visual experience vanishes, and yet the world itself does not. And so that shows that your experience of even surfaces that appear to be of the world itself must be actually inside your head. There's an important distinction between an ontological monism or dualism versus an epistemological monism or dualism. So in ontological sense, monist theory says there's one universe, whereas ontological dualism says that there are two different types of existence. There's the physical world of matter, and there's the spiritual world of mind. Science always prefers a monistic explanation because it's simpler, it's more consistent with Occam's razor. Besides, the world of matter and the world of mind cannot be completely separate universes because they come into causal contact whenever the world causes changes in the mind or whenever the mind causes changes in the world. So in reality, there is only one universe with its set of laws, and it includes both mind and matter. That's the ontological monism that we all espouse here at this conference. But there is a second issue with epistemology, or our source of knowledge, what we can know. And the epistemologically monist theory is that what we see in experience is what we think it is. It's the world itself. But epistemological dualism says there are two distinct entities. There's the world itself, and there's our experience of the world, and they are separate and distinct. For example, it's the same as the distinction between viewing a scene through an open window versus viewing a television monitor that's connected to a camera in some remote location. In the latter case, your information is dualized, epistemologically speaking, that what you're seeing on the screen is not the world itself, it's a copy of the world going through the camera system. And I'm saying the same is true of the human visual system, that we see the world remotely by a television, a vision of something remote, by way of a medium or a representation, just like the image on your television camera. So in epistemological dualism, there is no distinction between mind and matter, because a television system, which is epistemologically dualized, there's no spiritual, magical entities there. It's all just electronics and physical stuff that scientists all agree with. But and the same thing is true in our experience. The fact that when we look at a bright light, we see a retinal afterimage is proof that what we're seeing is indirect, that we're seeing an image on a screen, and the image has all these peculiar artifacts and defects, just like a television picture does, that when the motion is too fast for a television picture, it looks like it's jumping and jerky. If the brightness gets too bright, the image blossoms, it's oversaturated. And we see all of these effects in our own vision as well, and all of these are further proof that our experience of the world is indirect, our epistemology is dualized, and yet all under the umbrella of a monist ontology. One of the big questions about this issue of monism is, why does everyone think dualism? Where did that idea even come from in the first place? And I say that the reason why so many people naturally assume the dualist explanation is because unconsciously they recognize the dualism in our experience. From the earliest days of childhood, when you see an afterimage in front of your eye, you can see for sure there's something unreal going on over here. But which one is unreal? Is it the world, is it the afterimage itself that's unreal, or is it the world that's seen through the afterimage that's unreal? And as a newborn infant, your primary task is to notice that the afterimage is a blot in your vision, and you have to ignore it and look right through it. But the blot in your vision is itself evidence of a dualism, but not a dualism of mind and matter. It's not like the afterimage is made of spiritual substance, and that's why you can't grasp it in the real universe. But it is an image of the world, and it's indirect in that sense. If you take the right combination of psychedelic substances, you can get yourself into a state which is a full freewheeling hallucination, which looks every bit as real as this world. And yet you know it's not real because of the crazy things that happen in that world. You can have direct conscious control of those objects. You can say, give me a table, and a table will appear right in front of you as real as a solid table. Now, the first time you have this experience, you think, oh my God, what is this? What's going on? And the most profoundly shocking thing about the experience is a complete and total absence of your own body at the center of the experience. So here you have a space, somewhat like the space you see in this room, but there's nobody in it. And yet the space is crammed full of images that morph rapidly from one to another through all kinds of crazy contortions. And your sense of your own self is forced to migrate away from the body that is no longer there and takes up residence in the space itself. And you become aware of the fact that there's this spherical theater of the mind in which images are generated by your mind, full three-dimensional, solid-looking real images with color and lighting and shadow and mirror image effects and reflections and refractions, everything that we see in the normal world. And yet, obviously, they're not images of the world, they're images that are generated inside the mind. And that there shows that the space of our experience is a representational space that's capable of maintaining images, but the images have no real reality unless they happen to be coupled to external events. And this is the distinction that many seers and thinkers have made between the imaging mechanism that's capable of generating images and the images that it generates. If you believe that the mind is a physical process taking place inside the physical mechanism of the brain, and if you observe that mind is conscious, then that already is proof that a physical process taking place inside a physical mechanism can, under certain circumstances, become conscious. Now, the brain is a very special kind of mechanism, but what makes it special is not its substance. It's made of the same ordinary substance of matter and energy. What makes the brain special is its complex organization. So the fact that the brain, a physical process, can create consciousness itself suggests that all physical processes have some aspect, some primal proto-consciousness. I would say there's a rather direct analogy between a water surface and the waves that it sustains. The water and its surface are like the brain, and the waves that it sustains are like the mind. The waves are made of nothing. They're made of nothing but pure energy that rides on that boundary interface between the two different substances. And yet, they make physical patterns that interact, collide with each other, and interact in complicated ways, in the same way that the physical brain creates an arena, a playground where these images can come into existence and interact with each other. Yes, I think the fact that the brain, which is a physical mechanism, is capable of sustaining the mind, which is an energetic process, and the fact that this combination makes for conscious experience itself suggests that all physical matter has a certain primal consciousness. And the clearest example of this is in the behavior of water in all its complicated ways. You see water, for instance, running down a mountainside and building up a flow and carving away valleys, and if anyone stands in its way and tries to hold it back with a dam, the water builds up its pressure and builds up an urgency and eventually bursts through and charges on down the valley. Don't tell me that the water does not feel the urgency that it's clearly expressing. Well, the first thing that it will change is our concept of how the brain works. Right now, we are in a neuroreductionist era where people are making probes ever smaller and smaller to read into tiny and tinier parts of the brain and read the signal there and try to make some kind of sense out of it. The paradigm that they're thinking is discrete connections between individual neurons mediated by synapses and separate individual signals going every different direction. What we see in consciousness is a much more holistic process, something like water seeking its own level in a vessel, where the final state of the water depends on every position of every other molecule. If you change one portion, scoop out some water in one place or dump some in at another place, every single molecule in the bath quickly readjusts itself in order to seek a new level. It's a different paradigm of computation. It is what the Gestaltists proposed, field theories of mind, not in the terms of fields of mental energy propagating out into the world, but fields of physical energy in the brain interacting with each other in a holistic manner, the way that water seeks its own level in a vessel. So I think the understanding of the intimate connection, the monism, the unity between mind and brain will force brain scientists to reconsider the most foundational assumptions of how they think the brain works. In the earliest studies of neuroscience, when they first identified neurons as the basic element of the brain, that was the beginning of the neuroreductionist era, where people figured that if we can understand how a single neuron works, then we'll be able to understand how the brain works. But if the brain works by holistic principles like water seeking its own level, then studying one molecule of water tells you nothing about how water seeks its own level. A holistic process has to be studied as a whole. And the reason why modern science is hesitant to tackle holistic processes like that is because they're impossible to analyze by the normal means. The normal reductionist method of science is to break things apart to their component pieces and understand how the pieces work before you can put them together again. The only reason science does this is because it's just too complicated to try to understand the whole. So they break it into pieces. And that's valid for the kinds of systems that operate as individual pieces. But there's a whole class of different kinds of systems, holistic systems, that operate by a holistic principle, and those cannot be investigated by taking them apart into pieces. You have to model them as a whole.